星空，没人比得过天上云驰援啊！来，留下！许燕，是雁门的人。
谁姑娘？这是哪来的船？阿水姑娘，你怎么会在这儿？是庞公子带我来的。他说在这里会遇到你。
驰云号称天上云，你是追不上。
In modern Jewish history, and it begins with 3 words. Dear Lord Rothschild.
Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet.
Why was it that this letter was sent by the Foreign Secretary to your great-uncle Walter?
It's an interesting question because it was primarily a movement from Eastern Europe, but they didn't clarify who was in charge of that movement. And in addition, it was, after all, in Great Britain. So they felt that the Rothschild family should be the one to whom it was addressed. And Walter was Lord Rothschild, and he was a Zionist. And those really are the background reasons.
So Walter received the Balfour Declaration, and I have a copy here. And I wonder if I could possibly ask you to read it for us.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. I'm going to put on my spectacles to make sure I read it accurately. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment of Palestine as a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours, Arthur Balfour.
And here it is, the Balfour Declaration. What do you feel when you see it here?
I genuinely feel it's one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of the Jewish people. If you think it took 3,000 years to get to this, and then you say, how did this miracle happen? It's the most incredible piece of opportunism. I mean, if you think you had an impoverished would-be scientist, Chaim Weizmann, who somehow gets to England, meets a few people, including members of my family, seduces them. He has such great charm and conviction. He gets to Balfour, and he unbelievably persuades Balfour and Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, and most of the ministers, that this idea of the national home for Jews should be allowed to take place. I mean, it's so unlikely. And then he's, starts to fight a difficult battle with the British cabinet, and this letter goes through 5 drafts, as you know. And in the end, it comes out as a rather compromising letter. I mean, the essential point is there for the Jewish community to fasten on to. You have the first bit, which promises a national home rather than the national home, And then you have the bit that nothing that's to be done should in any way harm the Arab community. You come back to the big point, which is that this is perhaps the greatest event in Jewish life for thousands of years. And it's a miracle.
Listen up, people. In modern Jewish history, and it begins with 3 words. Dear Lord Rothschild.
Dear Lord,
亦不知所踪，亦不知所踪，而答案便在这一步之上。
燕
与常而任，色任凌风，这并非普通的言语。
信仰，雁门的信仰。
雁县东至百里，便是雁门。此河流贯东西，凶手若不想牵连雁门，定会西去。即便途中生意转而东飞，也会正好与我们撞上。
可是，这不可能啊！周姑娘何出此言？这雁门是什么地方？雁门最早乃是陆10年前天下大乱，建会率领众高手围杀一阙雁门，雁门提供了不少人证情。这门主江飞宇脾气暴烈，但性格却最是护短。听起来是个名门正派，不是听起来，是本就是名门正派。
杨尚兴原本也是名门正派。Enjoy the refreshing sweet flavors of Sun Apple. Again,
这是我从杨尚卿身上所得。实不相瞒，家师此次派我下山，不仅是为了豪府血案，也是为了这件事。
新癸酉凶晚，我亦有所关注。初4，便是唐某之看法。
那周姑娘，先别担心。
不说话就没事了。不要逼我！哼，不逼你，不逼你，我陪你跑下100多里路，玩呢。兄们，别中毒啊！蝼蚁上水偷生，千万别服毒。
Israel was founded on May 15th, 1948. But how exactly was that country born on land that was called Palestine and was already full of Palestinians? As recently as World War I, 90% of the people who lived in Palestine were not Jewish. But in November 1947, the United Nations, which only had a few of the world's countries in it back then, voted to partition the country. This plan marked off 55% of Palestine for a Jewish state, but the UN never explained how it could be a Jewish state when half the people in its territory were Palestinian. To nobody's surprise, Palestinians rejected the UN's plan, but it was accepted by the Zionist movement, which had worked for decades to turn Palestine into a Jewish state. The Zionists saw an opportunity. See, Britain had been occupying Palestine for almost 30 years, but around this time they announced that they were quitting the country and going home, and the Zionists knew that would leave them with the strongest military in the region. So they instructed their forces to take more land than what the UN had given them, and to do what they needed to do to reduce the number of Palestinians living there. In the cities, bombs were set off in Palestinian neighborhoods. Villages were attacked and residents forced out. After inspecting parts of Jerusalem that had been emptied of Palestinians, Zionist leader David Ben-Gurion said, "In many Arab neighborhoods in the West, you do not even see one Arab. If we persist, it's quite possible that in the next 6 or 8 months, there will be considerable changes in the country." The events that helped speed up these changes took place on April 9th, 1948, when the Palestinian village of Deir Yassin was attacked. A British government report to the United Nations described the scene. 250 people were killed in circumstances of great savagery. Women and children were stripped, lined up, photographed, and then slaughtered by automatic firing. What happened at Deir Yassin set off panic all over the country. As news spread, people fled, fearing they would be next. There were dozens of similar massacres during this time, resulting in entire Palestinian communities fleeing. By the time the last British soldier left on May 15, 1948, 250,000 Palestinians, a quarter of their population, had already fled their homes. The night before, Ben-Gurion announced the founding of the State of Israel with himself as its first prime minister. But the fighting wasn't over. Several Arab countries sent soldiers to try to defend the Palestinians, but the Israeli army was better equipped, better organized, and unlike the Arab armies, it had a unified command and support from some European countries. Israeli forces kept pushing into the territory assigned by the UN to a Palestinian state, and in towns like Lidda and Ramla, 50,000 people were forced to flee in what became known as the Lidda Death March. After being emptied, the towns were given Hebrew names, Lod and Ramla. The buildings and homes were taken over by the new Israeli state and handed to Jewish immigrants, and this happened all over the country. Israeli forces even pushed into areas like West Jerusalem, which the UN plan said should have been an international zone. By the time the UN secured an armistice, 3/4 of the Palestinian people had become refugees. In Arabic, they call this the Nakba, literally the catastrophe. The new state of Israel now stood on 78% of what had been Palestine. The remaining parts were annexed by Jordan or taken over by Egypt. A year later, the UN passed a resolution calling for all Palestinian refugees to be allowed to return home, but Israel has always refused to comply. Palestine had been erased. Israel was found
the fake birth certificate of what is known as Israel, Resolution 181. On November 1947, the United Nations voted for Resolution 181, the so-called Partition Plan. It was a proposal, not a mandate. Mainstream history calls it Israel's birth certificate, but in truth it was something else, a mask for empire. For the first and only time, the United Nations dismembered a living inhabited country against the will of its majority. Palestine's Arab population, 2/3 of the people, owners of over 90% of the land, rejected the plan outright. Yet the United Nations handed a settler minority, less than 1/3 of the people, control of 55% of the land, including fertile areas where Jews never settled. It was a precedent-breaking act of imposition, sovereignty gifted to colonists, legitimacy conjured from thin air, and behind it all stood Britain, the empire that had built the Zionist project brick by brick, law by law, gun by gun. Britain's hand, from architect to alibi. Britain had ruled Palestine since World War I. It promised a Jewish national home in the Balfour Declaration, embedded Zionist privilege in the mandate, and trained militias like the Haganah under officers such as Ord Wingate. But by the 1940s, the project was faltering. Jews remained less than 1/3 of the population, land ownership stayed under 7%, and Palestinians resisted with strikes and uprisings. Britain could not impose Zionism directly, not without endless revolt. So it turned to the United Nations. The Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, was dressed as neutral, but its members were the likes of Canada and Australia. In reality, it was dominated by countries within the spheres of influence of Washington and Moscow. Palestinians, boycotting what they saw as illegitimate interference, were excluded from the decisive stage. When the vote came, Britain abstained, not a refusal, but an alibi. Behind the curtain, it had already tilted the balance, disarming Palestinians, training Zionists, and preparing the stage for withdrawal. The theatrical war and the Nakba. Resolution 181 was never implemented. Its safeguards, equality of citizens, no expulsions, international oversight, evaporated. Britain refused to cooperate with the United Nations Palestine Commission, and when it withdrew in May 1948, it left a vacuum. Only one side was ready, the Zionist militias. They were armed, organized, and prepared to expand beyond the United Nations map. Ben-Gurion himself said the borders were temporary, a lever for seizing the rest. The Arab armies, Mostly British-controlled, many under direct British command, their movements were restricted. Their defeats were not accidents, they were managed outcomes. The war was staged to provide the myth of Israel as forged in fire and struggle. The war also served to choke Palestinian resistance while facilitating mass expulsions. The result, over 700,000 Palestinians expelled, more than 500 villages destroyed. Resolution 181 did not create Israel. The Nakba did. The resolution's true function was to provide the myth of legitimacy.